Welcome back for part 3 of this NavMesh door series. In the last two videos, we created our player controller and then we made some basic door setup. So in this video, we'll carry on from there and we'll start working with our actual door interactions and making our player wait before he proceeds through the door. So what we're going to work on now is when we were going through the door and closing, it was a bit jittery and there was a few times where the player kind of staggers a bit. A common issue I find with trigger colliders like this, where you enter them, a lot of the time your two colliders will actually overlap and trigger multiple times. And with this system, the way we have it set up, every time it's going to try to start the whole system over again, stop your player, things like that. So we don't want that to actually happen. Like if you put a debug.log message in this on trigger event for the door trigger, you'd see it trigger a couple of times usually. So we're going to make a cooldown where it doesn't check that for a while. So on our player controller here, up at the top, so here I'm going to make a private bool, and I'm going to call this has door been triggered, and we'll set this to false by default. Now I'm going to make a counter variable as well, so I'm just going to make it a private float, and I'll call it door cooldown timer. We'll just set this one to 0. Well, the way this is going to work is if we hit a door, we'll set it that we triggered a door and we won't be able to trigger a door again until the cooldown expires. So now in our trigger event for the door, in this if statement, we want to also add and not has door been triggered. So that way it's only going to call this if a door hasn't already been triggered. And now the first line inside this code block, we're going to put has door been triggered equals true. So now we just need to update that counter in update if the door has been triggered. So at the end here, let's add if has door been triggered. And then we'll do door cooldown timer plus equals time.delta time, just to increase the counter. And then we want to do if door cooldown timer is greater or equal to, and I'm just going to do 2 seconds again. So again, hard coding is not a good idea. I'm just doing it for this example. You would want to set something up better for that. So in here we want to set our has door been triggered equals to false to reset that, and we also want to reset the cooldown timer to 0. So this should resolve our jitter issue. So let's try running the game now, and then click to the other side of the door. That looked pretty smooth there, and then let's try it backwards just to make sure it's the same. Okay, and that looks smooth both ways now. So now the next thing we want to work on here is a little system that controls where our player goes when he goes to go through the door. So right now, as soon as he hits this trigger collider, it's going to start the door opening. But if you're blocking the way, the animation is going to play right through you. So we want to make something where we can actually set different positions for him to stand on each side of the door. So in this example on this side, if he approaches this door, no matter which direction he comes from, we'd want him to go in the bottom right corner of the screen here. And then that way when it swings open, it's going to avoid him. And then we can set something for the opposite on the back side as well. We also want to make sure the system's dynamic, so you can set each door having different positions where the player will stand in. Because for this one, it swings open. But we could do different examples like a medieval game where you have a drawbridge or something and it opens like this. You want to be able to set the position so the player is always out of the way when he comes to open the door. On the door controller script here, I'm going to make another public method. And this one we're going to call from player. I'm just going to make it void for now, but later we'll change it to return something. And I'm just going to call it getWaitPosition. And let's take in a vector3 in this one. I'm just going to call it position. And this is going to be the player's current position when this is called. Inside here, we need a vector that's going to store the direction from the door to the player, so we know where they are. So I'm just going to call it target direction. We'll set that equal to transform.position minus position. So if we take the door's position and subtract the player's position from it, that gives us the direction to the player. Now that we're getting a bit further into the script, I'm just going to start documenting with comments what each of these lines is going to do. So for this one here, I'll just put something like gets the direction from the door where the player currently is. Now I'm going to create a float to store the angle from the door to the player. So I'm just going to call this direction angle. We'll set this to vector3.angle, and then we're going to pass in there the transform.forward of the door, so the forward Z direction that it's facing, and then our target direction, which is the direction to the player. So what this is going to do is take these two vectors and give us the angle between them. So if we're looking at our game at the door, you can see the blue arrow, which is the Z-axis, or the forward, is facing this direction. So it's going to take the angle between this direction and then the one going from the door to where our player currently is here in this direction. This is going to allow us to use that direction to calculate if the player's in front or behind the door. And I'll just add another comment here, so gets the angle from the door to the player based on the direction above. Now we want to check if the mathf.absolute value of our direction angle is greater than 90. And we also want to check if it's less than 270. And if that's the case, then we know we're looking at the front of the door and the player's on the front side. So when we're looking at our door in the game here, the Z direction, the blue arrow, is forward. So this X arrow here, this would be 90 degrees. And then the other direction would be negative 90. I might have those two mixed up right now, but yeah, you're looking at 90 and negative 90 degrees. And then when you start going to the back side of the door, that's where you go below or above that. So you'll start hitting like the 270 degrees to 360 degrees. I'm not the greatest at vector math, so I actually just found this formula online just by Googling. So to test it out, let's make sure it works. In the first block, I'm going to put a debug message, player is in the front, and then I'm going to add an else, and then debug player is in the back. And then we'll test and confirm to make sure this does work as we intend it to. So to test this, let's just go back to our player controller, and in the onTrigger method is where we're going to add it. So right after the door open delay, let's call our door controller again. And then we're just going to call get wait position, and let's pass in our transform.position. And now with our game running, let's walk through the door, and there we got the front. And let's send them through back ways now. And player is in the back, so our vector math is working correctly. So now our code is able to determine if the player is in the front or the back of the door. So the next thing we need to do is tell the player where to stand when he approaches the door while it opens. In the door controller, let's make the positions we're going to stand at. So we're going to make a serialized field. I'm going to make a private transform. I'm going to call it front of door position. And then I'm just going to copy that one, paste it, and make another one called back of door position. So I'm just going to add a comment above of what these do here. So basically just that you can move them in the scene view and place them wherever you want the player to stand. And I'll make sure the code for both of these scripts is available in the bottom in the description of this video and each video in the series. Let's go back into our game now, and I want to select the door object, and I'm just going to rename that one to door. Now I'm going to create an empty game object as a child of the door, and I'm just going to call it front door stand position. And now duplicate that one, and I'll make it the other one back door stand position. And I'm just going to select both of them, and then in the inspector I'm going to set them an icon here. And my gizmos are currently really small, so I just have to rescale those up. Alright, now we'll have little blue icons showing which stand position is where. I'm going to move the fronted door position to somewhere that I wanted here, so just kind of in the bottom right of the door. Since it swings out the other direction, this should miss the player if he goes and stands here. The back door position we can just kind of put in the middle, just out a little bit, since the door swings the other direction anyway. The way this asset pack's set up, they kind of have prefabs in prefab, so I'm just going to select the parent of the door, break that prefab, and I'm going to create a prefab of the door. So now we have a simple door prefab we can just kind of drag and drop in to use anytime. And now just drag the front and back door positions into the slots on the door controller. Now we can go back in our door controller, and we're going to change this get wait position method to actually return a vector 3 now. And instead of debugging when we hit it, let's return front of door position dot position. And that name is bad, so we'll rename that in a second here. Let's also return the back of door position dot position in the else. And now I'm just going to go up and rename that variable. Instead of position, I'm going to put transform here, and then just update it in the method as well. And I'll just add a quick description above this method here of what it does, just so we can document all the code as we go through, and it makes it easier for you guys watching to read, as well as if you download the sample code from it, it's going to have all the comments I type here. Now in the player controller, I'm going to make another variable here, and it's just going to be a door controller. And this is going to be used to cache a reference to the door we're interacting with, so we don't have to keep searching for it every time and doing get component and everything. Now that we made a variable that we can save the door we're interacting with, we can add that in here. So I'll just put a little comment, and then we'll get a reference to that door and cache it, so we only have to actually check for it once. And now all of these lines where we do other.getComponentDoorController, we can just replace with door interacting with. I'll just space this out and add a couple more comments here for you guys as well. And now just below where we take away control, I'm just going to make a new vector3, and this is going to store the wait position that we want the player to move to. And I'm just going to set this equal to door interacting with dot get wait position using the transform dot position. And then we won't need the line down below that's calling that, so just delete that. So we now have a position of where we want to move our player to when he's waiting for the door to open. So the next step, this navmeshagent.isStopped line, we're going to actually remove this because we don't want to stop the navmesh now. Instead of stopping, we want to tell him to move to the wait position. Since we're still moving just to a different position, we can also delete this line telling the animator to stop running. The next line where we tell it to open the door, I'm just going to cut that, and we're going to move that in to be the first line inside of the coroutine now. So far we haven't actually changed the order of anything, so it still executes the same. We're just working towards that. So now just before we start this coroutine that starts the door opening sequence, we want to tell our NavMesh agent to move to the wait position and then start the coroutine. We also need to tell this coroutine not to open the door until the player reaches the wait position. So what we're going to do is set up a while loop in here. This is actually identical to the check we did earlier. So we're going to use vector3.distance between the NavMesh destination and the current position. And we're going to check if it's greater than the NavMesh agent stopping distance. So if it is greater than the stopping distance, that means we're not at the destination yet, and this loop will continue to increment. And since this is a coroutine, inside the loop we can just do a yield return null. And that's going to continue looping each frame until we do reach the stopping distance or the destination. We'll just add some notes here as well. So if you're not super familiar with coroutines, you can only do this in a coroutine. If you did this in a regular method, this would crash your computer because it would be an endless loop. But inside a coroutine, when we put the yield return null statement, that's going to actually wait until the next frame and do nothing until the next frame. So all this loop is going to do is keep looping until it reaches whatever the condition is to break out of the loop, but it's only going to increment one time per frame. So it won't run more than once per frame like a normal loop would. So once that condition is met, it's going to go below and run the next code, which is where we tell it to open our door. And let's go and run and test this now. And we're actually getting null references for the stand positions. So I guess the modification I made to the prefab earlier wiped those out. We just have to select the door again and just drag in the front and back stand positions. And now let's try that again. And when the player tries to go through the door now, we're getting some weird behavior and it's not reacting properly. So what's happening here is we don't actually know where to go at this point because we wiped out the destination with the position to go stand in. So now we have to update that and save that position. So let's go back to the player controller. And I'm just going to make a private vector3. I'm going to call this target position. So what we're going to do is every time that we set a stand position for the player to go stand in, before we do that, we're going to save the current destination so we know where the player is trying to actually get. And then we can set that again once the player gets to the door. Now just go back down to our door trigger block of code. And in here, somewhere near the top, anywhere before we set the wait position as the destination, we can do it right here. So I'm going to do target position equals my navmeshagent dot destination. And now we're going to have the final destination that the player is trying to reach saved inside target position. Now down below in the player's delay coroutine, so right after we do the door open delay, we wait for that time. Then we want to tell the agent to actually move to its destination. So we're going to call the setDestination method and pass in the target position. Let's go and test our game again, and this time it should be working. So let's click on the other side. He waits, door opens, goes through. That looks great. So let's go back, make sure it works from the back side as well. So he waits where he should here, and then he walks through, and this looks exactly what we want. I'm just going to go back into our scene now, and I'm actually going to select this door prefab that we made, and I'm just going to delete this one. And I'm actually going to make a prefab out of the parent of the gate, so this whole fence component. And I'm just doing this so I can make a little test scene with multiple doors to try here. I'm going to move the player down here closer to the camera now. I'll drag in one of those prefabs we made of the fence with the door. And I'm just going to rotate this. I'm not snapping or anything fancy. I'm just dragging it in just for a test. And then I'll duplicate this one. We'll put another one here to make kind of a wall. And then just rebake the NavMesh again. So let's run our game and test this now. And we notice the camera angle is not actually very good here. You can't really click past the fence. So let's just adjust that a bit. We'll look down a bit more, something like this. And then just select the camera and hit Control-Shift-F to center it on this view. Let's test out the game now. So we're going to move them up through this door. Everything looks like it's working fine here. And then we'll send them over to the left side and then down through the door on the left. And that's all looking fine too. So I'm going to go back up again. And now let's click on the far side so the player has to walk through both doors and make sure that's working fine. So there's the first one and the second one. And you notice he kind of walked into the second door and then went to the wait position and back up. And if we click back up, he'll probably do it again here into the second door as well. Yeah, so the same thing here. So what's actually happening there is that's the manual cooldown we set. So it's these doors are too close that it's not long enough, so we just have to tweak that. For a system like this, you'll find you'll probably have to do a lot of tweaking for your game. Same with if you're putting a lot of doors close together like I did in this little demo. You'll probably want to also make the trigger collider around them smaller. So if we go up in our player controller here, and we want to go to the door cooldown timer, we can adjust this value to something lower. And if you made this a variable that you can set in the inspector, then you could actually play around with it at runtime to test it out. So here I just lowered it to 1 second, which is half, and then we're going to test this out. Okay, so let's try this again. So we'll click up to go up to the top. So far so good here. Now let's click on the far side to go through both doors, and he should go through both of them properly. Okay, so that looks much better now. So yeah, it is something you just have to kind of tweak for your game and how you have it set up. And same with the size of the trigger colliders around the doors, like I was saying. You don't want them too big if you're going to be putting doors really close together. While playing around with it more off camera, I noticed some of the the issues were still there. So I'm just changing the delay to 1.4 seconds now, and this one seems to work better. So now everything seems to be running smoother again. So the one thing I can see being a problem with this system, I haven't really play tested it much yet, but it'll definitely need some tweaking, is for most games, if you have the big trigger colliders around the door and you're clicking into them to move, then he won't really have a destination outside of the door. So one thing that comes to mind you'd probably want to do is if the point where the player clicks to move is inside one of the door trigger colliders, you might want to do something where you have an actual set position on each side of the door that you tell the player to go to. So if his final destination is inside that trigger collider, then use the other one, and then that way it'll make him walk outside of the trigger collider, and then that should fix the problem. If that doesn't make sense at all and you want me to try making a video showing something like that, just leave some comments below and I can add a video like that to the series as well. But that should be fairly straightforward, but just let me know.